Hello, everyone. Welcome. We're excited to have you. As people start joining, I just want to kick things off. I'm Sarah Shepard. I manage content marketing at Mantra. I work on webinars, resources, and thought leadership, and I'm excited for all of you to join us today. Obviously, due to the overwhelmingly positive response to our last webinar, we wanted to extend this discussion and offer more practical tips for supporting neurodivergent students. So that's what we're focused on today. If you missed the last webinar, you can go back and watch it. I'll share the link in the chat. Today's webinar is scheduled for a full 90 minutes. We'll allocate 60 minutes to discussion and 30 minutes for Q&A. If you can't stay at the end, we totally understand, but please know that your questions will be answered at the end. You can use the chat feature anytime. Please introduce yourself, add your school, why you're here, and then add your questions to the Q&A feature. We will send out a short survey after, so please fill it out. It'll take less than a minute, and it helps us plan all of our events. And we'll also send a recording to all who RSVP'd. Now, since we're here, I'm excited. I'm going to pass it over to Dr. Chugani, who can get started.
All right. Hi, everyone. I'm so glad you're with us. I've been giving versions of these talks for a couple of years now, and it's just wonderful how many more people are showing up this year than have shown up in previous years. And so I just want to thank you all from the bottom of my heart for caring about our neurodiverse students, which includes people like me. So I'm Dr. Carla Chugani. I'm the Vice President of Clinical Programs at Mantra Health. Basically, what that means is that I have the best job in the whole company. I get to oversee the clinical quality and designs of our products and services. I am also a therapist by training. I'm an expert in a particular type of treatment called dialectical behavior therapy, as well as an academic and faculty member at the University of Pittsburgh School of Medicine. Personally, I was diagnosed very late in life with ADHD, and I had the pleasure and privilege of designing our Mantra Health's coaching program for students with executive dysfunction. And we have just found that so many of you out there care about this topic, care about learning how to better serve these students, and so we're delighted to welcome back these three absolutely brilliant, field leading, thought leading panelists today. I quote them constantly now. And so I want to give each of them a minute to introduce themselves. We've prepared a really interesting discussion for you today that is heavily influenced by the feedback we got from our last webinar, where many folks in the audience gave us very pointed feedback about more of this, more of this. So hopefully you give us the same feedback, and hopefully it's a wonderfully productive session again today. So I will pass the mic around, starting with Dr. Porporiso.
Hi, thank you. I'm Cindy Porpariso. I'm Director of Disability Services for Rutgers Health Sciences Programs. I'm a brown-skinned, cisgender, disabled professional with glasses and very short gray and black hair.
Thank you. And apologies that I said your last name wrong, Cindy. And Dr. Babcock.
Good morning or afternoon, everyone. I am Amanda Babcock, and I am an academic initiative strategist and accessibility expert at Western Governors University. I am very excited to be here again. This has been such an enriching experience to engage with all of you, and I look forward to today. So thank you.
Fabulous. And Dr. Nigodula.
Oh, thank you, Carla. Hello again, everyone. So Dr. Amanda Niguidula, I am currently the director of the Disability Resource Center here at Florida International University in Miami. We are a research institution, Hispanic serving institution, a state university. So we definitely have to be engaged in supporting our diverse learners. It's about 6% of our current enrollment are identifying as students with disabilities. And so this is a topic that not only am I thrilled to engage in this dialogue and these fellow experts to present on, but it's a topic that is important for me to continue to understand and dig into on a daily basis because it's dynamic and it's ever changing. And in order, even though we may, I may lay claim to some specific professional expertise, it's really interesting to be able to not say I'm expert in neurodiversity. So that hopefully will give you a little lean in to part of this conversation. And again, really happy to be back and hopefully share some tangible, practical tips that each of us use in our work and with our colleagues that you can maybe take some things away from as well. So thank you.
Fabulous. All right, so I am going to be moderating the discussion today. And in our first webinar, which as Sarah said, it's recorded and we can share the link with you, you can review it. We did do a little bit more of like basic definitions of what is neurodiversity, what is universal design. And this webinar is a follow-on to that one. So today we're starting with the assumption that you already know sort of at least a basic definition of what neurodiversity is. And one of the things that we wanted to open this conversation with is some guidance about how we are identifying folks. So as student-facing professionals, when we think to ourselves, I might have this student in front of me may be neurodiverse. What is it that we are actually picking up on? And in what ways should we be being careful and mindful about what it means when we apply this tag to people?
So I'll go ahead and jump in here and get this conversation started. And thank you, Carla, because isn't that the question? Isn't that what we're all hoping to take away? We're all sort of like, what am I supposed to be doing? Not doing? Am I supposed to know this? How am I supposed to behave similarly or differently within my professional scope? So yes, they asked me to cue this up. But typically what we're picking up on in our work as is if it's student facing or in a support role or a campus services role, many of you probably are not necessarily in a disability services role, but you're certainly experiencing students that you might be noting are engaging with you in a way that either you are not comfortable with or that seems to match a type of diagnosis or a checklist that you've come across in the past in your attempt to understand students with disabilities or persons with disabilities. So typically what we're doing inadvertently when we're trying to understand and position our work appropriately for neurodiverse students and learners, we are picking up on lack of eye contact, maybe not following through on important instructions, maybe some behavioral physical traits or repetitive types of behaviors that are making us uncomfortable while we're trying to communicate or work through a session or an advising interaction. However, here's what we have to work against. When we start seeing behaviors that are either making us uncomfortable because we've never come across them, they seem unusual for the context as opposed to other students we might have interacted with prior, is not to, as Carla already mentioned, neurodiversity definition says this is not a medical definition, this is not a checklist, this is not one diagnosis. It's a broad umbrella term that helps us understand that learning and thinking and brains are rich, different, and unique, right? And so there's not a typical that's good and a neurotypical that's bad, anything like that. So when we are seeing these behaviors that are either unusual or remind us of other types of disability services or clinical checklists we've come across, or they're making us uncomfortable, what we want to do is be curious and focus on how we can engage our work with more intentionality, grace, and flexibility. So what we want to go against is pathologizing, diagnosing, pulling out maybe old reference materials that said, oh, you know what? I think I know what this is. This is probably fill in the blank. The cautionary tale here, and I speak from personal experience, that will not be the toolkit that will give you the opportunity to meet this neurodiverse student who may or may not even self-identify, or use language such as I'm neurodiverse. But clearly, there's a call to action to engage that client with care, concern, and diligence. And so we'll get into, and I'm going to do a handoff now to my colleague Cindy, who's going to dig into some specific examples that you might be coming across in your work and engagement with neurodiverse students.
Thank you. So as an action item, one of the things that we can do is when we see some of these behaviors that we really stop and evaluate and rethink some of the assumptions that we've been conditioned to make over the years. For example, when we go into our classrooms or our office and we see somebody with their head on their desk, what do we automatically think? The person is tired, the person's not interested or invested, the person was out partying all night. But when we think about some of the things that are happening with folks who are neurodiverse or neurodivergent, is that there's a lot of sensory issues going on for some of these people. And sometimes the filters aren't working right, or are working differently. I shouldn't say they aren't working right, they're just working differently. So if you think about all the sensory input we get every day, we have visual input, we have things that we smell, taste, feel, hear, and all of that's coming at once. So it could be that somebody puts their head on their desk because they're trying to eliminate some of that sensory information that's coming in at them. So if they can eliminate what's in their visual field, they might be more able to concentrate on what's being said. The same thing goes with somebody who's wearing a hat in class. You know, I come from the school of thought where that's disrespectful in some settings. But it could be that there's a extreme light sensitivity. So the person has the hat on to eliminate that glaring light. And again, that allows them to concentrate more fully. Another example is somebody who's not responding to facial expressions, or somebody who is mimicking or reciting things back to you. It could be that you're thinking that they're not paying attention or they're being disrespectful, but it could be that they need extra time to really process the information that's being said to them. So there may be a delay in processing facial expressions. There may be a delay, somebody may need to repeat things back to allow themselves more time to process what's being said. Another couple of examples, if somebody doesn't recognize you, we could think that they're being, again, disrespectful, or they don't want anything to do with you, or did I do something wrong that they're not engaging with me? It could be simply that they have so much going on at the moment with all that sensory input that there's a delayed reaction or no reaction. They're needing to move on or hold on to what they're currently processing. If somebody doesn't shift topics on cue, they may not pick up on some of the subtle cues that we give, especially if those cues are based on body language. Sometimes there's difficulty interpreting body language. So it's always important to express what we want to express, whether it's moving on or instructions, in more than one way. Don't depend on body language. Use body language and verbal cues, or body language and written information, or all three. You know, the more types of input we have, the more populations we are impacting in a positive way.
Thank you so much to both of you for kicking us off with that. I want to get us into what I mean, I guess this is maybe like one of the most foundational things that anyone who cares about giving our neurodiverse students a good first experience with us, or first impression might want to know. And this was also something that came up in the feedback as please, please, please tell us more about this. So I wanted us to talk through a couple of points under the umbrella of how do we navigate conversations where a student is self-disclosing to us that they are neurodiverse. And the first sort of chunk of this is, how do we respond, whether we're faculty, advisors, student affairs professionals, how do we respond in the moment when a student self-discloses?
Yeah, that's such an important place to start too, because I think the assumption is that we're supposed to know this automatically, that we're supposed to be comfortable hearing this information, processing this information, and responding to it. But the truth is, most people really don't have any official kind of training or guidance or mentorship around navigating complex conversations related to disability or neurodiversity. And so one of the first things to remember is that it is an act of sharing, it's an act of trust. And so when you have a student, a peer, a colleague, or even a family member or friend who is sharing this and disclosing this information to you, the first thing that you want to do is thank them for sharing that. Say, hey, I really appreciate that you trusted me with this information. I know it's very important and this could have been a difficult thing for you to do. So I want you to know that I'm going to honor that act of sharing. That's really important because there are a lot of situations in which students with disabilities, neurodivergent students, have shared this information and been immediately shut down, been told, no, that's not a real diagnosis. No, if you don't have that document from a psychologist and $2,000 worth of testing history, then it's not a valid thing. And I think it's important to remember also that they are going to be disclosing this information in a variety of settings. So whether it is a one-on-one conversation, it might be in a group chat during a live cohort recording, it might be in an orientation or an advising session. So we have to make sure that we're not policing the students or the peer or whoever it is that's disclosing to us and saying, oh, well, this isn't the right situation for you to say this to us, or let's do this another time because I'm not comfortable doing it here right now. I've seen very well-intentioned people have students come up to them at a tabling event or an orientation event, and the student has said, hey, I am neurodivergent. And the person at the table says, I'm sorry, I don't want to violate your privacy by having you talk about this here, when the student themselves initiated the conversation. So first bit of advice there, the quick tip is thank them for the trust and what it means for them to have disclosed that information. Don't police them based on the situation, but then focus on why they are disclosing this information to you. What is it that they want you to understand? It's never usually about, hey, this is my diagnosis. It's almost always, hey, I want to share this information with you because this is the impact. That is what students are struggling with. That is what people with these diagnoses are struggling with in these settings, because these settings are not set up for neurodivergent people. So as you are having this conversation, focus on what they are conveying in terms of the support that they're asking for, the adjustments that they're asking for, or that they maybe aren't asking for, but they're hinting at, or that you could fill in for them. As you follow up with these students, ask them direct questions. Say, hey, what has worked for you in the past? Or what have you done for yourself during your study sessions that helps? Maybe we can adapt that into our advising relationship, or maybe I can bring that into this classroom. It could be something like, okay, I'm going to send you an email in advance before we meet with a summary of what we are going to talk about so you can prepare. Then we're going to have the conversation and you don't need to take notes because I'm going to do that and send them to you as a written summary. Oftentimes people like myself, I was recently, well, in the last 3 years in my 40s, diagnosed with ADHD. And I didn't understand that a lot of my adaptive behaviors were because of ADHD, and that's just not how all people do things. And so I have a hard time focusing and writing notes and having too much stimuli. And so when other people are able to take that off of my plate in one-on-one meetings, for example, like with my advisor for my doctoral program, she would take the notes and then send them to me after because she knew I needed to pay attention. In some cases, those conversations, if you don't feel like you're able to come up with the solutions for the student or the ideas for how to support the student, you can invite in another support staff, a peer that maybe works in the disability center if you're a faculty member, or if you are new to advising someone who has more experience that might have experience working with neurodiverse students. It's never wrong to pull on all of your resources in advance to support the student and the person disclosing that information. And it's also important to remember that these skills and these tips and these approaches to communication are transferable. And as we were planning this, Cindy actually had some great examples of, why this is transferable to other situations, such as engaging with fellow employees.
Yeah, and Cindy, I wonder if you want to expand a little bit more about how the sort of concrete tips that Amanda is giving also can extend to our colleagues and direct reports and employees at the university.
Sure. Well, while we're focusing today on students, everything we say can in some way transfer to employees. For example, if you have an employee who's neurodivergent, they may need to not only see instructions, but also hear them. So, providing instructions in multiple ways is always beneficial. There may need to be communication that is more redundant. As Amanda said, if the person's in a position where they need to be able to listen without taking notes, having a summary of the meeting or even a recording of the meeting available is a very concrete way to assist people that are neurodivergent.
Yeah, so I just want to summarize because we did receive very clearly the message that folks want concrete, actionable suggestions, which is really relatable content, as the youth say. Um, just to summarize, and colleagues, please chime in if I'm missing anything. It sounds like some of the key points here is thank the person for the disclosure, right? Treat this as like somebody who is placing some trust in you. Be prepared for the possibility that students will walk up to you having never met you before, such as in an orientation setting, in a early on or first meeting, advising meeting. Be prepared for students to disclose this type of information very early on in your relationship with them, and be prepared and willing to respond supportively. So, I mean, to me, that means not only the like, thanks for sharing that with me, but also like, tell me a little bit about how this impacts you. How can I support you? Be knowledgeable about the resources that are available on your campus in case the student is interested in those. They might not be. Right. I also heard both Amanda and Cindy talking about follow-up, the importance of follow-up, right? And sort of recording information and adapting your engagement with this person, whether it's a student or employee, and adapting communication in ways that support that person's success, right? If they need to just sit and listen, to be able to record the meeting or have somebody else take notes can be the like biggest blessing. And then we also have the opposite getting highlighted in the chat right now, which is, you know, Jackie and Amy in the chat both kind of saying, I'm the opposite. I have to take notes to be able to focus. And that's fine too, right? So it's not meant to be a dichotomous list of always do this and never do that. The goal is adapting to what supports the success of the individual, whatever that may be.
And following that individual's lead. I think that's really important because sometimes we get very prescriptive, kind of as we were talking about earlier, where we have this knowledge of diagnosis, we have this knowledge of clinical approaches, maybe depending on our field, or we have these trainings in our background that kind of present a diagnosis as a monolith of experience, right? All students who are autistic have these qualities, all neurodivergent students who have ADHD, OCD, whatever it is. So I think following the lead of the person who is sharing with you is incredibly important, and framing your conversation, your questions, your potential resources or responses or follow-up in terms of them as an individual and acknowledging that autonomy they have is really important, because there is nothing monolithic about the disability community or the sub-communities within the disability community. And people themselves we are all, you know, bringing different skill sets, backgrounds, identities, intersectionalities with us. And so the more that you can personalize your response to that disclosure and build a follow-up relationship with it, or follow-up actions on what that person is actually expressing about themselves, and not apply all this larger theory, I think that's going to lead to more success in developing a strong relationship based on trust and the belief that you have their best interest in mind and that you are a safe person to go to.
And as Carla said earlier, it's important to know your resources, but not only for the students, but for yourself. Somebody that, you know, the go-to person or office to help you, to help the student. I know on my campus, and I don't know if this is true universally, when a student discloses, we want to give them an array of resources, not just say, okay, you need to connect with disability services. We give them an array of resources based on the behaviors that they're describing. So that might be counseling, it might be tutoring, it might be disability services. So we try to give them that array, but there's also people on your campus likely who can help you to know what to do and say if you're stuck.
So well said. Two more small tidbits that are probably a little redundant, but based on what everyone has shared, but something that I remembered. I don't always know what to do. So a student will disclose, and I have this amazing opportunity to work with our disabled student union, a student group that's imbued, embodied, led, grassroots, disabled students. So when we talk about using our resources, that is a go-to. And they have allowed me to speak honestly and candidly and take risks and make mistakes and give me support and guidance when needed. So that has been an invaluable tool in my work. So that's a type of resource example. It doesn't always have to be in office, the department of, the SME, the subject matter expert, all of those folks are part of that array of resources, but don't stop there. Also, let it go professionally. So I've had 30 years of school. And so I have been trained, programmed, and bought into the idea that I'm supposed to know things, particularly when it comes to my role or work. Every once in a while, I get in the way of myself. I over-respond. I sometimes start answering because I want to signal that I care and I'm prepared. And at times that hasn't been my best way of proceeding when someone, as Amanda shared, has signaled trust and interest in whatever it is, my department or whatever tabling we're doing. And I've sort of gotten in the way of myself professionally. So being self-aware, which is with all of our group and lived neurodiversity ourselves, is something that some of us have to work harder on than others. The last thing, in terms of a skill or a tool that I use, when I still am not sure, why a student has approached me or a member of my team in what I think may not be the ideal setting, to identify and share their identity and perspective, I use a strategy. Something I know really well is a disability services unit that I oversee. So sometimes I'll do this thing where I'll say, thank you so much for your trust. I'm really glad you're here today. Let me tell you a little bit about what I do at the center. And so, because you know how we've all sort of agreed and recommended that you apply the student's disclosure and trust to adapting or engaging to meet their request or needs, they may not know what their request is yet, because they actually don't know if their first time in college or testing out this identity. They may not know what to ask. So I sort of go into the mode of, I can talk about me, my professional role, and see if they have follow-up questions. So when I don't know what to do, which is completely okay, and I want to get out of the way of myself professionally, I talk about the department, what's coming next, what's on the agenda, how you might engage, and see if there's follow-up questions. So that's an actual strategy I use quite frequently. So I wanted to share that.
That's so awesome. One thing I just love about that too is that it's leaning into, it's a technique that everyone could start using today, because even if you don't know the rest, you know what you do, right? So now I want to just shift the conversation a little bit. We've talked about how to respond when a student self-discloses. The other side of that coin is a student is coming to you as a trusted advisor or staff member, mentor, those kinds of roles. And they're trying to get some guidance from you about how to disclose their neurodiverse identity to others. How do we advise and support them when they come to us seeking that type of guidance?
So I will start, but I know my colleagues have a lot to share on this point. And again, this is stuff that even as we are preparing for this webinar and do this work quite comfortably and competently in our particular roles, we have intensive dialogue around this approach, these perspectives. So they're not fixed. So I want to be upfront about that. But one of the things that comes up is, how much do we really need to know, and the specificity to already ourselves, as folks who have had a lot of educational training, opportunities to engage in our own personal and professional growth, how much technical or specific information do we need to really begin to deploy our adaptations in our approaches? So sort of, I think when a student, and I've had many colleagues, professionals, students say, I think I need to disclose this aspect of my disability or my identity or my neurodivergence in order to explain, in order to justify why I might need to sit here and not there, why I might need different cues in the classroom because I'm getting responded to like I'm interrupting, but I'm just really engaged in the content. And I feel that it's starting to be held against me professionally. But I'm also afraid if I say too much about something that seems unusual or not typical in this professional setting or training situation, they might just direct me to like my office, the gatekeeper role, to get an accommodation letter. And the students are not necessarily wanting to have that conversation. I can give, so two parts to that. One is students often, if they can professionally matriculate, advance, engage, without necessarily having to or being required to engage a gatekeeper office like mine to get an accommodation letter, by providing a lot of information that actually may not even be acted upon, nor may not be relevant in the educational scenario or setting they're in on the day-to-day, is cumbersome, time consuming, and sometimes just exhausting. So they're looking for guidance and advice. And we have to be very careful about that. because what I try to do is listen about the program, the experience, or the dilemma that they're having today. And again, step away from my sort of checklist training, and I go through pros and cons. So I say, yes, there is a risk that you might experience misunderstanding and perhaps some bias. Let's talk about what navigating that might require. So really, that's just one example, but helping the student, giving them the attention and time to say exactly what I'm sharing with you. There's so many variables to this, but I hear that you're wanting to take a risk, you're wanting to be known, you are concerned about the professional or student trainee feedback you're receiving, and you'd like to address it beyond the scope of an accommodation letter. And there's personal relationships also likely involved, and you want to navigate those successfully. So I really try, and I have a sign in my office, and we're going to talk about this. It's meant to be humorous to an extent for those who appreciate humor. And it says professionally awkward. And I have that on my desk because one, I'm professionally awkward. But two, there's a lot of things in my office that signal I'm competent, I'm trained, I've arrived, I understand. And that can sometimes work against giving evidence or example that these risk-taking conversations are part of being me and part of being you. Another thing about the notes, and this will touch masking. So many students, particularly if they can hide or not disclose, if it's not feeling or seeming like a particularly valid opportunity, or there's a lot of risk taking that's being assessed in particular professions, namely clinical professions are some that stand out, the student will mask. And that's sort of a fancy word. You all probably have come across it in different ways, but my example of masking is about notes. So we all have a story about notes. I'm a really engaged learner. I love school. The other side of that is I can't listen and engage, and I'm highly engaged, very verbal, and take notes. But as I was going through formal post-secondary education, there was a very strong understanding, an unwritten rule, a taken for granted, that students of success and students who were serious and students who are not there to waste faculty time took notes. And so I began the practice of taking pretend notes, which I did for 20 years. It became a sort of inside joke for folks who know me because I very studiously had notebooks and pens. I always got out my notebook, began taking my non-notes, because otherwise, at times, my faculty, teachers that I admired and was there very much to learn, would write me off as not being serious just because of the performance of taking notes. So for 20 years, I performed taking notes. I also obviously was a little ashamed that unlike my peers who clearly could take notes and also engage, I could not, and I didn't know how to navigate that. So the other thing is, I still sort of pretend to take notes when I'm not sure about the expectations professionally or otherwise, but full disclosure, I've never taken a note in 30 years of higher education.
Yeah.
Yay! And I'm not saying that notes aren't important. I love to note things when I'm reading or engaging materials privately. I cannot do that in a formal, engaged setting. It's actually impossible for me. But I didn't want to signal that I wasn't a concerned, invested student or professional, very much the opposite. So exhausting is masking is exhausting. It limits your ability to be your authentic self. And I believe, like all of my colleagues here, and it has been proven, I have a lot to contribute. And if it was limited through the lack of understanding about note-taking or not note-taking, I think that could have been unfortunate for all my colleagues, classmates, group members, professionals who didn't get to have an opportunity to engage with my evolving view of the world. So I will say that humbly, but authentically. So that's the notion of masking and having these experiences, being able and comfortable to share those with our students not to say I'm just like you, because as we've even seen in the chat, that's never going to be the case. But to say, I too have had to navigate some challenges. And so even though I have these things in my office that say I have been serious and intentional, I'm still professionally awkward. And to show that paradoxical dichotomy, that can very much be true, and sort of create that space where they can say, I thought I was the only one, or could we talk more about that? So I'm going to hit pause because I know my colleagues also have antidotes to offer on this topic.
Yeah, I think this one is particularly near and dear to my heart. And, I think about these conversations so much from a mentorship and student success perspective. Having engaged with many students in that capacity as their mentor. I was not diagnosed with ADHD when I was a postdoc, but I remember it being very obvious that I did not fit in with the other postdocs. And I was talking with my mentor about this, and she said, Carla, you do not fit in, but in the best possible way. And what I learned from that, even before I knew the cost of masking for me, what part of what I learned from that is that actually standing out is not always a bad thing, right? Standing out because you're doing a disruptive behavior, like that is probably not your best tactic to, professional success. But standing out because you're just different, you're more creative, or you express yourself a little bit differently isn't inherently bad. And what I have personally found, again, this is, my own lived experience, is that standing out and being a little different is probably part of the reason that I have gotten some of the opportunities that I have received. Um, so that was a really meaningful interaction for me. And it helped me learn as an employee how to be more successful in my workplace. So, for example, we recently at Mantra hired a new chief operating officer. He's my boss. He's fabulous. I wrote a dossier on every employee that was going to report up to him, including myself. And I put details in there about some of the behaviors that I do in meetings, like cracking jokes and cheering, right? They could be at first blush interpreted as being a little unprofessional or maybe not taking the topic seriously. But in fact, this is how I engage. This is how I show my authentic engagement. Very similarly, I have sensory stuff and I don't wear jackets and blazers and, trousers. I just like to be free, you know? And so when people know that about me, they're able to interpret some of the behaviors that I do that fall, a little bit outside of general social expectations for fancy business ladies or whatever we're calling it now. That they know that this is just like, I do my best work. I show up as my best self when I am physically comfortable and not overstimulated and feeling over constrained by certain types of fabrics or constraints on my body. And I want to pass the mic to Cindy too, who has a really another fabulous story about how masking and becoming aware of it can really change everything.
Thank you. Amanda and Carla both talked a lot about masking as a student, but as an employee, there's also a heavy cost, and it is exhausting. And I've always been very open with my coworkers about a sensory related disability that I have. And they've always been wonderful and tried to work with me. But it wasn't until COVID, when we started working from home, that I realized just how exhausting masking was. All of a sudden, I'm at home, I'm able to control my environment, and I had all this extra energy. And it was life-changing, really, because I really didn't know. I didn't understand that having to control all of the sensory input, I didn't realize what a role that played on me or how heavy that was on me. So when it was time to come back from COVID, I was able through HR to request accommodations that had to do with being remote part of the time. And I was able to get documentation and go through the process and have the support of the school, the department I worked with. And it's just been life-changing. And so when we expect people, whether they're students or employees, to behave as the norm, we need to understand that there's a cost.
Absolutely. I had a very similar experience. Being able to work from home and control my environment gets so much more productivity out of me. It's wild. Um, I want to move us along. I see we have about 15 minutes left before our very luxurious Q&A period. So I wanted to ask us as a group to give some tips for folks who are supporting students in the process of conversing with their professors to ask for assistance. Because even though we know that typically the letters go out, that is not the only way this occurs. It does, and the letter doesn't always solve the thing and get the students' needs met 100%. So what are some strategies that we can use to assist students who are in need of guidance about how to interact with faculty?
All right, this is such a critical relationship in higher ed because how you engage with and respond to and how they respond to you with faculty can really make or break your comfort in a class, your confidence in a discipline even. And I think it's a really good point that you just made, Carla, that even when we send the letters of accommodation, sometimes there are still additional conversations that need to be facilitated between the professor and the student about, well, what does this actually look like in practice? How do I administer this in real time in the classroom? And although I think a lot of times, even with the most confident students who are very comfortable in speaking about their disability, disclosing their disability, we have to acknowledge that sometimes the power differential that takes place between students and faculty, fear of stigma, internalized ableism can alter even the most confident contributors to a conversation and send a conversation down an unknown path. So I've been following this chat, and it's very timely because Harry and Lori just had an exchange about the idea of ADHD as a superpower, right? Where I know people who view their ADHD as a superpower. It makes them more creative. They have this amazing pattern recognition ability. And so for them, having it identified as a disability feels wrong or inappropriate or even insulting or demeaning because they're drawing on their neurodivergence to fuel their passions, right? I have a friend who's a graphic designer who feels this way. Conversely, there are others who say, you know what, I am debilitated at times by my ADHD, and it's not a superpower, it's hindering me, and that's why I'm asking for support. And so I would say one of the first things, keeping in mind that this power differential, the internalized stigma, the fear, the ableism in our country, these varying perspectives are always underlying all these conversations, is as you assist a student or guide a student in how to approach their professors, you have to understand how they view their own relationship to their disability. Are they someone who embraces it? Are they resistant to it? Do they not even think that they have it and the diagnosis was wrong, but they're reluctantly seeking support? And start from that approach, because it's really, you have to understand what they're actually asking of their professor or why they're approaching the professor first before you can provide that guidance. Once you have that understanding, then it's time to get into the specifics of what's prompting them into that conversation, right? How are you trying to explore maybe ways the professor can help you? Or are you asking the professor in this active disclosure for additional resources that they can refer you to outside the classroom? What is the purpose of this conversation? Once you have that down, I think the most important action item that we can do in advising students or coaching students is give them a language that they share with the professor, because professors are these highly, trained, very immersed in their discipline people. Yet we're not always speaking the same language as a student up to our professor, right? We don't always have the same language around classroom management, for example, or study skills or our approach to assessment. So I think one of the most important things we can do is help the student understand the kinds of language they need to communicate what they're actually asking. What is the ask, right? We say this a lot in business settings and in professional meetings, like, what is the ask here? And if we can help them have that language and connect with their professor through a shared language, I think their communications are going to be more effective. Because right now, I think a lot of students know there are faculty misconceptions about neurodivergent students and what their role is in supporting them and what the limitations are in their ability to even converse with a disabled student about their disability. And I think that also can translate into a hesitancy or a fear or apprehension on the professor's part to give any kind of behavioral feedback, right? So you have a student who's sought out help, who has an accommodation letter, they've had these conversations, but the student is engaging in some kind of disruptive behavior in the classroom. And it creates this tension between the student expressing their needs and, hey, this is who I am, right? They've shared, kind of like you said, that dossier on themselves in this environment, but the professor is saying, hey, I understand that, but your behavior in the classroom is negatively impacting my ability to teach or the experience of the other students, right? So once you give them the tools to engage with that professor by creating a shared language or maybe running through coaching the conversations. I talk to myself a lot as an ADHD person. I practice and rehearse conversations. Sometimes conversations I'm never going to actually have with people in real life, but it helps me process what I want to say. And so you can coach the student, you can play the role of the professor, you can help them navigate resistance by kind of modeling what that resistance might look like or might feel like. But then once they actually have that conversation, there's still another layer about what it looks like in practice in the classroom. And there've been a couple comments and questions and things about this, right? Like, what happens when that student that has shared and disclosed in the classroom is actually having behavioral issues in the classroom? And what are faculty seeing that they interpret as problematic or, maybe disruptive that are a result of the disability versus just what any student might be doing that's disruptive, right? It can be hard to share that. So, when you do coach students to talk to faculty, shared language, model the conversation, anticipate pushback, and anticipate a positive response too. That's really important. I had a student recently that I was working with. She has a service dog, and she is in her final year of a double major, fifth year senior in complex scientific disciplines. The entire time she was at the school, she had no problems knowing what to do with her service animal in the lab environment. She ordered a lab coat and custom fit it to her dog. Dog had the goggles, the booties, all the safety equipment. She gets to her last semester of her last year of her undergrad and is told by a new professor that her dog is not allowed in the lab. And immediately she cannot go to this classroom, this lab environment, because without her service dog, she's not getting those life-saving critical alerts from the animal that she needs to participate equitably and fully in the environment. And so when she came to me, um, her issue was not like, what are my rights? It was like, hey, you're the representative of the school. You need to intervene here and let this professor know what my rights are and that he cannot deny me when I'm following all these other, steps in this process. So she was fully informed. And so was coming from a place of power and knowledge and language that then I was able to take that conversation, intervene, and eventually the situation was resolved where she was able to bring the dog into the lab. And I can tell you, just with a minute knowledge of what her condition was and what her dog was trained to do, I saw her dog alert her during our conversation. And I don't think a lot of people know that, right? That like they don't know what to look for. Other students, maybe a first-year student with a service animal who comes into a biology program, they're not going to have that same need and that same guidance in interacting with a professor. So just keep that in mind. Students come with their own competence levels. But when they do engage in problematic behaviors, right? Let's say they are getting up and down from their seats. Maybe they're taking over conversations in a classroom. I think we've all been in that classroom, right? Where one student dominates the conversation the entire time. How do faculty respond with this? Because it's not just the needs of the one student in the classroom, it's actually the needs of the entire classroom in the academic and learning environment. So I'm just going to transition here to this point and start talking about this now. So let's say, what does a faculty member do? So first of all, I think it's really important to stress to your faculty that they're not alone in this, that the Disability Services Office and faculty support systems are there to help them workshop through these questions. And so if they are uncomfortable with something that's happening, they don't have to figure it out on their own. They need to go to their own resources. And the Disability Service Office is also there to support the faculty and staff working with students to understand what their role and their obligations and what their limitations are. But honestly, I think the best thing for when a student does become disruptive is to stop and ask yourself, what am I perceiving? What is the root cause? And what can I do? What am I in control of in this environment that I can make adaptations for or adjust so that the disruption is minimized or the behavior is minimized? And I'll give you an example. I recently met with an entire department that was struggling with this question of, is it behavior or is it conduct, right? And the first thing I said to them is that the presence of a disability does not excuse poor conduct. And so a student who has a disability is not exempt from the code of conduct of the institution. That's where you get into these questions of otherwise qualified, right? And so you have to remember that the presence of a disability does not excuse all behavior. And I think people forget that. But what it does is it helps us go through another level of examination and consideration when the student does have the disability, when the disability is present. So the example of the student that takes over conversation, this was not my point. I think this was Carla, but she said, one of the approaches that you can guide faculty on is if you have a student who's just dominating the classroom all the time, sharing every question, overriding everyone else, then at the beginning of the course or at the beginning of a class session, you can set an expectation for the entire classroom that says, okay, during our class today, everyone can respond to up to 2 questions, up to 3 questions. But then we're going to put a limit on that so that everybody has an opportunity to engage in the limited time we have. In that instance, it's a brilliant suggestion because one, it sets an expectation that's applied to the entire classroom, and it's not isolating the student, and it's not demonizing the behavior, right? We're not saying you're wrong for this behavior. Your interest in engaging is not wrong on the basis of your disability, right? Your lack of self-regulation or social intuitiveness is an issue. We're not framing it as a negative. What we're doing is we're observing the behavior and identifying a solution that can then be applied to the classroom in a way that isn't isolating of the one student or critical of the student. Another issue that sometimes happens is the idea of a student's movements or body kind of twitching or moving around and shifting or getting up, getting down, leaving class. That can be very disruptive, right? So I had a faculty member say, well, I had this student who had an accommodation for frequent bathroom breaks or to stand during class, and he always chose to sit in the middle of a long row of seats so that when he did leave class, he had to excuse himself like in a movie theater, right behind every single person, and people had to move, and it could cause like sound disruptions, physical disruptions. And the solution there was to pull the student aside and say, hey, I want to be able to facilitate your accommodation as best as possible, but I've noticed that this is happening. Why don't we have you reserve a seat here at the end of the row, closest to the exit, or in a place that will facilitate your accommodation without causing disruptions or having to involve the other students when you're using your accommodation. And the student responded positively to that because they weren't being vilified and the behavior wasn't being vilified, but it was a solution to a potential disruption.
And I
There
think
are,
what
Oh
is
yeah, go
so
ahead.
great about that particular, like I remember when we were discussing this in planning, one of the ways that you described working with that student was really coming at it from the perspective of like, what can we do that minimizes this disruption, but also still allows you to use your accommodation as fully as you need to. So it is a really, communicating that you're coming from the standpoint of we need to find a solution that allows you to use your accommodation to its fullest, right? And I thought that that was a really good point to hit. We are really running out of time, so I'm going to transition us to our final question. Um, before I ask the final question, one thing that I learned in this webinar today was the importance of follow-up. Um, and I noticed that actually quite a few of our people, our audience members are self-identifying in various ways in the chat. So thank you all for your trust. There have been so many useful tips and ideas shared in this webinar, and I am aware that all of us on this panel are so passionate about this topic that sometimes we do information overload. So while Dr. Babcock was talking, I actually messaged our head of marketing and was like, could we do a follow-up blog post where we just outline the bottom line key takeaways that each of the speakers gave? Because we have the recording, right? So we can translate this. So I'm going to do that. And that's going to be my follow-up. The last question that I'm hoping we can touch on briefly before we get into Q&A today is something like quick tips to start thinking about if you want to incorporate universal design into your professional practice and activities. What are those, low-hanging fruit strategies that people could start doing today, this week, this month? Cindy, would you be willing to kick us off?
Sure. So some of the easier, low-hanging fruit types of things that could be implemented right away are just ensuring that we communicate clearly. And when we talk about universal design, just real quickly, these are strategies that will benefit multiple populations. So not only clear communication, but also multiple modes of communication. Say it, write it, if possible, demonstrate. Also, plain language. We in higher education are often so familiar and inundated with our abbreviations, and we assume that everybody knows what those abbreviations mean, but our students may not. So plain language. If we can have earplugs, whether it's in our offices or even on our desktop, that can help students who may be having difficulties with sensory input. Also, as instructors or people who work in offices, be open to meeting flexibility, whether it's in duration, whether it's in pacing, whether it's in how the content is delivered. Are we allowing for in-person plus Zoom plus phone calls, or are we limiting the ways that students can contact us? Just remembering that everybody is comfortable with something different. How flexible can we be? And then when we're looking at long-term investments, can we think about things like decompression rooms? Are there areas on campus or in particular buildings where people can go just to decompress, just to get rid of some of that sensory input, just to be able to block everything out, to get a moment to regain that energy, knowing that while we're in the classroom, there may be some masking going on. Where can I go to just regain my energy? Automatic doors. better lighting? Can we have an intuitive wayfinding type of software? Knowing that neurodiverse people, again, have so much input going in, it may be easy to lose concentration and forget where I'm at. So they can just pull up an app to say, okay, remind me where I need to be or how to get there.
Yeah, absolutely. And one more dimension of this, I'm hoping someone can weigh in on is like, so Cindy, you're hitting on like, communication strategies and more long-term investments in the physical environment. Is there anything else that we should be thinking about for folks who are not necessarily faculty, so like some type of student facing professional like an advisor or a counselor or res life, where there's a lot of maybe one-on-one interaction with students, and are there any other quick tips for those kinds of folks that are less educationally focused but still like welcoming, accommodating, inclusive?
Something that can be very impactful and is very low energy is if it's just a sign on in your office that students can see when they're sitting talking with you that says something to the effect of, how can I make my office more comfortable for you? And an example you might put, for example, can I turn the lighting down? Can I turn the music off, or can I turn music on? I think we have to be careful with how we say that, because we might get what we ask for. But so there have to be some guardrails around that. But to let the students know that you're aware that they may be neurodiverse, that they may have some sensory conditions that you can help them with, and that you're willing to make adjustments for them.
I think one of the most interesting things about where we are now is this burst in recognition of neurodiversity and neurodivergence, right? This was not something that we talked about. When I was a kid, ADHD was boys, and it was boys acting in a specific way. And all of my neurodivergent things that in hindsight, I was like, how did I not get diagnosed, right? There's this proliferation of knowledge because of social media. And I think one of the most probably one of the easiest things we could do is start going to social media spaces to learn from people, right? Actually autistic people, Reddit threads about it. There's a lot of people asking these questions like, how do I talk to my professor? How do I talk to my resident advisor? How do I talk to my roommates at college? Go onto social media, go onto TikTok, go onto Instagram, go into the Reddit threads. And I don't know what the other, I'm too old to know what all of the sources where kids go these days are, but there's so much good first person perspective conversation happening where you can watch these videos, read these little posts, and understand and walk away with a sense of, okay, this is what that experience is like. Sometimes we rely on our student in front of us to educate us and do the labor of telling us what they need, when there are people out there who are doing this for their communities in a public realm that we can consume as, as people who are curious and seeking knowledge. And even as someone with ADHD, I learn all the time about the broad range of ADHD and experiences. And sometimes I recognize my own behaviors and sometimes I don't. But I think we should embrace social media and this proliferation of identification, even without diagnosis, because it's good. It's a really beautiful, vibrant community, and you can be a part of it without being intrusive or prescriptive.
I love that. Thank you, both of you. I call that this whole part that just got shared by Cindy and Amanda, I call that be better. So I think a lot of times we've been trained and tasked to focus the conversation on, how do I respond to this student or this individual or this problem or this identity or this behavior? And it is really refreshing to hear, you know what? You can also focus on being better. We love the idea of knowledge consumers and that we're lifelong learners. We really love that idea. But then sometimes if it might challenge us to rearrange our office furniture from time to time or dim a light that's always on, we kind of get a little stuck, right? Speak from experience. So sort of becoming a connoisseur of these first person lived narratives and ways of being and is about us. So expanding our expertise, our knowledge, and making this the word I think of is customary. So again, it's not necessarily a skill, a task, or a set of criteria where we arrive and accomplish. It's that we're aiming to make presence of accessibility and adaptability customary in our work. And one of the ways we do that, we have to be engaged and informed and curious in the same way we were about some of our professional expertise and pursuits. So that belongs very much to us as individuals who are seeming to want to claim understanding and participation in a neurodiversity worldview. And I welcome that, but it means be better, right? And to use those skills in a way that we become consumers of these experiences and work hard to imbue them in our day-to-day practice. So that's my...
Absolutely. So we all agreed. So we have 3 lovely questions, which I think we're going to be able to answer all of them so far. And we had agreed, as a panel that we really wanted to close this session sort of striking the middle path between the very clear desire in the audience community for concrete, quick, actionable tips. This is on one side of the dialectic. I'm a DBT therapist, so I'm just going to talk about it that way. One side of the dialectic is teach me stuff that's easy to understand and easy to implement. And then the other side of the dialectic, the other side of the coin, however you want to call it, is that, even when we're using universal design principles, nothing is ever truly universal, right? Nothing is really going to fit everyone. And so your homework as an audience member, if you choose to engage in it, is to do a little bit of maybe further reading about some of the principles and guidelines of what universal design actually is. And then reflect on your daily interactions with your students. So consider what are some of the most common tasks or conversations or work activities that you as a staff member engage in, and start to consider how might universal design apply to these interactions, the most common interactions that you have as part of your job. And so, the reason we offer that as like a further activity is because although we can give you quick tips, some of the most meaningful changes that you can make are likely to be specific to the very important work that you do on campus, situated within your campus community and the culture of your community. So you are also going to be one of the greatest experts in terms of what are the changes that you as an individual situated within a community can make that will have impact for the students that you serve or your colleagues, the employees that report to you. So with that, I'm gonna read some of the questions that we've received in the Q&A. If you have a question, please feel free to continue to submit them. So the first one says, I work with numerous neurodiverse students in my position. My challenge is the assumptions that other professors or staff make about these students, as discussed in the beginning of this session. What are some suggestions for getting everyone on board with looking at our students with an open mind?
I think it goes back to challenging their statements. And that goes back to, we talked about like not assuming malicious intent, or our students are not trying to annoy you. They're not trying to be disruptive. They're not trying to frustrate you. And when you have those staff meetings, when you have, department or division meetings, if you can incorporate students into those and say, okay, so one of our professional development items we're going to do this quarter or this year, or whatever it happens to be, we're going to, kind of aggregate in advance some of your perceptions. There's no right, there's no wrong. Like when you hear this diagnosis or you see this behavior, what are your assumptions? And bring those together in advance for that meeting, for that training, whatever it happens to be, and then have some students, because I think there's this misconception that students with disabilities in general, don't want to call attention to themselves, and that's true for some, but there are lots of very proactive advocate students on your campus that if you put out a call and said, hey, we are looking to have a panel of students or a conversation, a focus group with students to talk about these things, they will respond. They will come running for the opportunity to have their voice heard. There are not a lot of opportunities for students with disabilities to share their perspectives or voices with administration, with faculty, with staff, because institutions pretty universally have a very paternalistic idea of they have to protect and shut down those students for their rights, right? We're going to protect the students' rights, but the students are screaming like, please hear me on this. So I would say, gather up those concerns or gather up those misconceptions and then have the students come into your spaces and address them and have some, prepared answers. So, I was one of those students that was always doodling in my books, and I was an English major in my bachelor's degree. I was always doodling, and sometimes professors would think I wasn't paying attention, but 20 years later, I can tell you, if I open my copy of the Iliad and I see a specific doodle, I remember what the conversation was in the classroom on that day. I remember my friend Liz was talking about the manacle of love and all these terminologies. I remember it because I have a physical connection to the page through the doodle that connects me to the, recognition of the conversation. And I think when people start to hear that, then they start to loosen up those misconceptions. Another thing you can do is to ask people to reflect on their own behaviors that others misperceive, right? Because we all have people who don't perceive us as we intend. Sometimes I get told I'm a little too, I'm abrupt, or sometimes you get told that you're intimidating. Well, what does that mean, right? Like, so have them address how people misperceive them and then apply it back to how they perceive students. I think when you make it about them and then apply it outward and give them examples, it's going to help facilitate that open-mindedness, or at least that reconsideration of perspective. You're not going to be successful with everybody. There are some people who are very stuck in their perceptions, but you will hit the people that are open to learning and expanding their ideas.
Also, taking a step back and just engaging in professional development like you're doing right now. And not only for yourself, but if you take notes, or if you take the synopsis that Carla will be sending out and share it far and wide. I make it a habit of, when I learn things, sharing things out. And I think sometimes my colleagues want to tell me to stop it because I share so much. But it's important to say, hey, this was new to me, so that they don't think it's just them. If you learn something new, oh, I didn't know that. I'm glad you shared that. So that professional development is essential.
Absolutely. One more tip I want to add before we answer the next question. So some of the coolest ideas that I have learned about for responding or including neurodiverse students in different kinds of ways have actually come just from other folks in these communities of people in the audience of these types of webinars. So I would be willing to bet that your your student affairs professional community, disability professionals, learning circles, and all the different ways that we connect professionally, there are lots of cool ideas out there about what people are already doing on campus to solve a particular problem. And some of those tips may end up being more relevant to your professional practice than some of the ones we discussed today. So that's just another wealth of information to consider tapping into. The next question we have from the audience is from the perspective of a club advisor. So as a club advisor, how can you support both the neurodivergent student and the other students in the club to connect?
I'll jump in. So I mentioned I advise, I'm the staff co-advisor of our Disabled Student Union. So the mission of the Disabled Student Union is to bring awareness to the authentic lived experience of disabled university students. Really simple. But the mission also creates opportunity for non-disabled students to join in, because that's what we want. And that's what students want. They want to invite their friends to game night, and their friends may or may not self-identify or have an accommodation letter. So one, just trying to say, the role I play is, what kind of room space are we looking at? Does it kind of, based on my ever expanding knowledge and awareness of what's useful and what's not, being able to assist in saying, does this room have multiple kinds of seating? Do we need to like look at a different location? What, giving feedback on the types of games, because it may be really intuitive for certain types of learners and participants, and not so intuitive for others. So even saying, do we have different games, and can we play this one and then that one? And so really just trying to take all this information that keeps coming across my desk and my learning and from student confidence, and then very judiciously and appropriately funneling it back into the planning conversations. It has been an interesting experience because, as we probably recognize, the disability identity in the past and still has been carved up frequently for understanding into medical bucket diagnoses, problems to be fixed, things to be cured. And while that has its use value in particular settings, it has migrated into settings where it's not as useful. So the students themselves, and here's an example of the way we've sort of attempted to address the difference between engaging both neurodiverse learners, participants, and other students who may have different disability identity or not identify as disabled at all. We have a conversation opportunity like once every month, every other month, as frequently as it can, where it's called Disability in Context, named by the students. And it's just a forum where a student who champions or self-identifies with a particular lived experience, diagnosis, or identity related to disability hosts Disability in Context and leads the conversation. In no way was this my idea. In no way was this advisor driven or led. I really love the idea. Of course, I'm a fan. But my job is to assist that it's well promoted, that I show up and assist with any logistics that may become barriers. For example, one of my most important skill sets is that I'm a very good door holder. So at times we have unexpected barriers that students may not be able to enter the room. So I remember my skill set of being a door holder, and I hold the door and I welcome people in. So it's whatever it might be in that moment, but I keep trying to bring increased knowledge, understanding, correcting where I've misunderstood, and doing better. But really that partnership and relationship and just leveraging what students with disabilities and without disabilities already have on their agenda is beautiful and quite easy to do. And those unnatural sort of diagnosis dichotomies and bifurcations, they begin naturally when they're all playing sensory Uno to abandon them and find new ways of interacting that are much more natural and organic based on their demographics as students. So it's something you just have to chip away at it. But all the things we've already talked about, you're going to keep layering them in. right? And you're going to keep kind of checking and looking at resources and engaging the students. I don't want to give the impression that everything we're doing is highly successful and figured out. That's not the case. I'm obviously highlighting some things that have gone well. But the disability in context and the game night scenarios, I think have really helped get some of these entrenched misunderstandings released and a little less on in the center and a little more to the edges. So that's my recommendation.
Thank you so much. So I think we have time for one more question. And it is a meaty one. So we'll do as much as we can. When it comes to professional training in student services, how do we meaningfully see the students' experience with student services when they are neurodiverse? And this is the language of this is a little bit unclear to me, but the way I'm interpreting it is sort of like, how do we understand what kind of experience we are giving this group of students? Like, how do we self-evaluate essentially? If anyone's interpreting differently, please let me know.
So I'll head this one off because this is part of, so I recently completed my dissertation, and it was on the student experience and students with disabilities. It was about the accommodations process, but the conversations, as you know, tend to go larger. And I think the short answer is you need to ask your students. You need to give them the opportunity to provide feedback in a safe and trusted way. At WGU, we engage in any number of touch points along the student life cycle that asks about their experience. So we ask questions at the end of a course. What was your experience with this course? Did you enjoy this? Did you feel it was beneficial to you? Those kinds of things. We ask questions at the ends of their terms. And without talking to them directly, it's conjecture on the part of the institution. We can kind of get a sense of things by what students share maybe in social media or if they communicate with you directly. But the truth of the matter is, without asking your student population directly in a way that will prompt honest feedback, you are making guesses at best. And one of the findings for one of my participants in my dissertation was that the lack of understanding or recognition of his particular type of neurodivergence, how it showed up in his interactions with staff members, caused him to completely shut down and avoid those services entirely. He had situational mutism and a lot of anxiety. He went to the counseling center, for example, for help, and the person at the front desk was abrupt and dismissive in their first interaction. The selective mutism kicked in. He left, and he never went back to the counseling center for help. And so I think having direct voice of your students and surveying them or getting some kind of forum where they can provide that feedback is really helpful. But at the same time, helping people understand what it actually looks like in real life, right? We can say selective or situational mutism, but what does that look like? Like, that doesn't mean anything to people who don't study disability. What does it look like if you're an advisor, if you're a staff member, if you're in student services, if you're the front desk? Like, if you see a behavior, like, help people recognize and understand what that means. So that's you have to ask them. I'm a firm believer in asking them.
In addition to my role in disability services, I'm also an adjunct instructor for a community college. And something that I implemented many years ago is an anonymous activity halfway through the course called Positive Delta. And delta in science terms means change. So I asked students to tell me what has been positive so far for you in this class, and what if you could make any changes in the class, what would those changes be? And I've been able to really address some things that students wanted along the way. And it's been a very valuable part of all my courses.
That makes so much sense. And it's a great segue into the final minute of our webinar. So Sarah has diligently been reminding folks in the chat to please complete the survey that will pop up after the webinar ends. And positive delta, right? Like, we love hearing your great feedback, but very genuinely and legitimately, the things that you tell us that are areas where we can improve, or areas where you want more information that we didn't provide, that is feedback that we take very seriously. And this is how we design this webinar series. It's all based around trying to give you all more of what you want and what's going to be useful to you. So we thank you so much for your time. We thank you for your attention, your presence, and hopefully there's a part 3 in our future. I don't know. I don't get to make those decisions, but I mean, any chance to be with these 3 fabulous people, I'm down for it. So thank you all so much. Thank you so much to our panelists, and we will see you next time.
Thank you, Carla.
Thank you.
And Cindy.
And just before we end, I think we're getting a couple more requests for the link to part 1. I just want to make sure that gets in the chat before we end the webinar officially. But we will also follow up with the recording for this webinar, which is part 2, as well as some of the follow-up key takeaways in written form. All right, so thanks so much, everyone, and we'll see you next time.